I used to think the scariest envelope in a mailbox was a bill I had forgotten about. Then the association discovered my front yard. By the time I held that first thick white envelope with the association's logo stamped in dark ink, I was already wondering if one ridiculous drought fine was about to break us before the next inspection even hit the calendar. The number 3,000 floated in my mind long before it showed up in writing. It was the kind of amount that did not destroy your entire life, but it did shake every single plan you thought you had under control. Groceries, savings, kids' school clothes, car maintenance, the emergency fund that already felt more like a wish than a reality. I had no idea that a patch of carefully chosen desert-friendly turf was about to threaten all of that, just because it looked too alive for some very bored people with clipboards. Our street sits in one of those master-planned desert communities where the sun bakes the sidewalk and the mountains in the distance look like cardboard cutouts. The houses are stucco, the roofs are clay tile, and every driveway carries the same faint dust no matter how often people sweep. On paper, it is a dream of order and stability, the kind of place where the lawns should all look the same and the rules promise, protecting property values. In practice, it can feel like living inside someone else's personality test, where one person's taste becomes everyone else's obligation. I did not move in planning to star in a Karen neighbor drama. I just wanted a yard that did not turn into a dead patch of mud every summer, a place where my kids could step outside without sinking into gravel or burning their feet on bare concrete. So when I opened that first envelope and saw the bolded word violation, my heart kicked once, hard, and then settled into a slow, steady anger. The sun outside glared against the cream-colored walls of our cul-de-sac as if it were in on the joke of how petty this was about to get. I did not yet know how far the board president would go, or how obsessed she was with what she called visual cohesion. I did not know our lawn would become a hill she chose to die on. But as I flipped to the second page of that letter and saw the reference to an obscure clause in the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CCR Section 4.3 drought-tolerant landscaping, I realized something else. If they wanted to make this about rules, then every rule in that binder was about to become my weapon. When we moved into Desert Vista Estates the year before, the community welcome packet looked almost comically friendly. There was a glossy brochure with staged photos of smiling neighbors, empty sidewalks, and a few strategically placed cacti in white planters. Tucked in the back was a fat, 3-ring binder with Community Standards Handbook printed down the side, heavy enough to be a doorstop. I carried it home from the HOA office in one hand while balancing a small box of kitchen stuff in the other, the decomposed granite in the common area crunching under my shoes as I walked to the car. That first week, I flipped through the handbook at the kitchen table. The pages smelled faintly of toner and cheap paper. Most of it was what you would expect: trash cans hidden from view, no boats in driveways, parking rules, noise guidelines. Then there was the section that would come back to haunt us, an entire subsection on landscaping. CCR Section 4.3 was titled Drought-Tolerant Landscaping and Turf Alternatives. It talked about water restrictions, the need for conservation, and how the community wanted to encourage sustainable choices while maintaining a harmonious visual aesthetic. There were rules about plant lists, about ground cover, about heights and setbacks, about approved rock colors and mulches. Tucked into a short paragraph was a line that stuck with me: artificial or enhanced turf is permitted, provided it is maintained in good repair and maintains a visually natural appearance consistent with surrounding properties. To me, that sounded like permission. It sounded like someone, at some point, had acknowledged that grass in the desert is an illusion anyway, so you might as well make the illusion efficient. Our old rental had a patchy yard that died every summer, and the water bills there had felt like punishment. So when we bought this place, we budgeted to do it right: native shrubs, drip irrigation, and a small, clean rectangle of high-quality synthetic turf framed by gravel and river rock. We researched brands, got samples, and even checked with the management company before we signed a contract with the landscaper. The woman at the front desk told us, in a bored tone, that as long as we used neutral edging and did not put in any wild colors, we were fine. We submitted a quick sketch, some product information, and received a one-page approval form a couple of weeks later. To us, that was the end of it. The box was checked, the project was blessed, and the binder's rules had been respected. What we did not factor in was our board president. Her name was something forgettable, but everyone just called her the board lady when talking about her in low voices on the sidewalk. In my head, she quickly became Mrs. K, because it was easier to file her that way, the kind of person who had never met a rule she did not want to enforce on someone else. She lived 3 houses down, in a place where the front yard was a study in beige rocks, beige walls, beige succulents in beige pots. The first time she saw our completed lawn, she slowed her walk and stared at it. The turf we chose was a rich, balanced green with mixed blades and a bit of realistic thatch. It looked like what grass is supposed to look like when you are not trying to pretend it is dying on purpose. She studied it the way someone might study a stain on a white shirt, and the look on her face was not curiosity, it was offense. Over the next few weeks, I noticed her pausing out front more often. Sometimes she would stand on the sidewalk, arms crossed, scanning the yard, then our house, then back to the yard. She made comments in passing about keeping things natural and respecting the desert aesthetic, always framed as gentle reminders but carrying the weight of a warning. I shrugged it off, because the approval we had in our folder felt like armor. The board had already said yes. I did not realize then that the signature on our approval form came from the management company, not from the board itself. That tiny difference, that small technicality, would become the wedge Mrs. K needed to pry our entire front yard into a problem. The association, after all, is not just a set of rules, it is also the people who decide when to enforce them. And some people are only happy if someone else is in trouble. The first official hint that this was turning from mild tension into a real HOA versus homeowner conflict came on a Wednesday afternoon in early May. Our mailbox is one of those shared metal clusters at the end of the street, and as I opened it, a single thick envelope slid into my hand. The return address flagged it immediately, not a bill, not junk, but the association's management company. By the time I made it back to the house and set the envelope on the counter, my stomach already knew this was not going to be a friendly reminder. Inside was a form letter, but it referenced us by name and our lot number. At the top, bolded, was the phrase, Compliance Notice 24-051, Non-conforming front yard turf. Below that, it cited CCR Section 4.3 and claimed that our lawn did not present a visually natural appearance consistent with surrounding properties. Attached as a second page was a blurry printed photo of our front yard, taken from across the street, along with a box checked next to Action Required, repaint or replace turf within 14 days. Repaint. That word sat on the page like a joke someone forgot to explain. According to the letter, the board had inspected our property and determined that our grass appeared unnaturally green and artificial in a way that conflicts with the community's desert-forward appearance. They insisted we either repaint the turf to a less saturated color or remove it entirely and replace it with approved natural alternatives. I flipped the pages back and forth, looking for the sign-off. At the bottom, in neat, tight script, was the signature, Board President. There was a date stamp in the corner, May 2, 2024. Our first official evidence prop in this mess, a compliance notice that tried to police the color green. At first, I did what any reasonable person does when faced with something that sounds like an error. I assumed it was a misunderstanding. We had the original approval tucked in a file folder, the one-page landscape modification approval, with the manager's scrawled initials and a date from last fall. So I called the management company, described the letter, and asked if someone could double-check our file. The woman who answered the phone sounded rushed, flipping through something on a computer. She confirmed that yes, they had an approval on file, but it had been processed as an administrative okay, not a formal architectural approval. That distinction, she explained, meant the board still had the right to review the finished project and require changes. She suggested I write a response, attach a copy of the original approval, and send it in for the board to reconsider. So that night, I sat at the dining table with the notice on one side and the handbook on the other. I reread CCR Section 4.3, line by line, tracing each sentence with my finger. Nowhere did it list approved shades of green. It did not include color swatches or a saturation chart or even a description of what natural meant. What it did say, tucked into a subsection, was that drought-tolerant alternatives were encouraged, and that any disputes about compliance would be resolved based on consistency with the written standards and any previously approved designs. That phrase was the one that caught my attention, previously approved designs. If other homes had artificial turf, and if ours had been approved as well, how could they single us out for being too green? I typed up a calm, detailed letter. I summarized the timeline, attached a copy of our original approval, and highlighted how the handbook encouraged reduced water use. I mentioned the turf's technical specs, pile height, thatch blend, UV resistance. Most importantly, I pointed out that there was no specific rule about color, and that our lawn was well maintained, free of debris, and fully consistent with the standards described on paper. I sent the letter by email and dropped a printed copy at the management office, making sure to note the date and time. I also took my own photos of the yard, from different angles, making sure the neighboring yards were in frame. If they wanted to turn this into documentation, I could play that game. The desert sky outside was cloudless and pale, humming quietly with the sound of distant air conditioning units as I stood in the driveway and snapped the last photo. A week passed. No response. Then another envelope appeared in the mailbox. This one was thinner, but the tone inside had sharpened. The second notice thanked us for our correspondence and acknowledged the original approval, but it framed that approval as conditional. It said the board had reviewed their decision and determined that the turf's color remains out of harmony with the community's visual standards. They extended the deadline by 7 days, as a courtesy, but the last paragraph introduced a new threat. If we did not comply by May 20th, daily fines could begin accruing without further notice. This was the moment when irritation shifted to something closer to fear. Daily fines meant the number in my head was no longer random, it was a ticking meter. The letter did not state the exact total we could reach, but it mentioned a schedule of fines up to the maximum allowed under the governing documents. In other words, they had options, and none of those options were cheap. I went back to the binder that night, flipping through sections I had ignored before: enforcement procedures, fine schedules, appeal rights. There it was, in dry legal language: for ongoing violations, the association could fine per day after a certain period, up to a cap set by the board. The enforcement section referenced notices, hearings, and something called landscaping exemptions, which sounded like a loophole someone buried and forgot. If there was a way to turn their own rulebook against them, I was going to find it. There was now a fixed date on the calendar, May 20th, a silent deadline when our quiet desert street would either look exactly the same or our bank account would start bleeding daily. What the board did not realize was that by circling that date, they gave me the one thing their power could not control: time to read every line of their own rules and prepare to push back. I started paying closer attention to the other yards. There were at least 3 houses with artificial turf that looked just as green as ours, and one that looked even brighter. Some had obvious seams, some had faded patches, some had weeds poking through the edges. Yet none of them had violation notices taped to their doors or extra envelopes piling up at their mailboxes. I took a slow walk around the block one evening, my phone in my pocket, mentally noting addresses. The desert wind was dry and restless, carrying tiny bits of dust that stung the skin. I wondered if any of those owners had gotten letters too, or if we were the only ones being singled out because our lawn happened to offend the personal taste of one person with a title. At this point, the situation still looked small from the outside. It was just a lawn, just a color, just a couple of letters. But beneath the surface, something bigger was starting to form: a pattern of selective enforcement, a hint of abuse of power dressed up as concern for community standards. I could feel the story shifting, turning from a simple annoyance into the opening chapters of a much larger association drama. In my head, I kept replaying the wording of our second notice. Without further notice. It sounded like a threat, but it also sounded lazy, like they assumed we would fold the moment money was on the line. The more I thought about it, the more determined I became not to be the quiet example they used to scare everyone else into compliance. The neighborhood gossip circles started to notice too. Neighbors would glance at our yard a little longer, slow down when they drove past, linger an extra beat at the mailboxes. No one said anything directly to us at first, but you can feel when you have become the unspoken topic on a street. That subtle social pressure was part of the design. It always is in places like this. At the same time, I could also see the association's narrative forming. We were the ones who pushed the limits, the owners with the too perfect lawn, the people who had turned a desert lot into something that did not blend in properly. From their perspective, they were protecting the neighborhood from turning into a patchwork of competing ideas. From my perspective, this was starting to look like a textbook HOA ridiculous rules case waiting to blow up in their faces. So I made a decision. If they were going to escalate with fines after May 20th, I would escalate with information before that date. I would learn every inch of that handbook, track every deadline, and start assembling every piece of paper that might matter later: approvals, notices, emails, photos, even the little compliance notice 24-051 that had seemed so absurd at first glance. By the time the next envelope arrived, I would be ready to treat this not as a note about my lawn, but as evidence in a much bigger fight. The funny thing is, stories like this never feel like a full-blown petty revenge HOA saga when you are at the beginning. They feel like a series of small, boring frustrations: a letter, a deadline, an annoyed neighbor, a binder of rules you do not want to read. It is only when you look back that you can see the turning point, the moment where you stopped being passive and started preparing to push back. For me, that turning point sat right there, in early May, under the cold fluorescent light of my kitchen, with a compliance notice spread out on the table and a deadline circled on the calendar. I did not yet know about the stack of fines they would try to build on top of that notice. I did not yet know how far they would push, or how humiliating it would be for them when their own landscaping exemptions came back to bite them. All I knew was that our lawn was not the problem. The real problem was the people who believed their authority was a blank check, and I was finally ready to start writing my own terms on the same piece of paper they were using against us. The next phase of the conflict did not arrive like a dramatic knock at the door. It came as a spreadsheet. About a week before the May 20th deadline, I received an email with an attached PDF from the management company, labeled Courtesy Violation Status Update. When I opened it, the screen filled with rows and columns, each line item tagged with our lot number and a short description: non-conforming turf, courtesy notice, compliance deadline. At the bottom, there was a new line that had not appeared before: potential daily fine, $50 per day starting May 21st. In a separate column, a faint note: subject to board ratification, maximum cumulative fine $3,000. The number that had been hovering in my mind now had a home in writing, anchored to our lawn like a price tag no one asked for. It was not just a threat, it was a plan. I printed that spreadsheet and added it to the growing pile on the dining table. Next to it, I laid out the original, compliance notice 24-051, the approval form, and my own letter. The table was turning into a crime board, except the crime was apparently the color green and the suspect was our front yard. Outside, the late afternoon light slanted across the blinds, painting pale stripes across the paperwork and reminding me that every day the sun went down was one day closer to May 20th. 2 days later, the first actual fine hit. Another envelope, thinner this time, arrived in the mailbox. Inside was a single sheet labeled Fine Imposition Notice. The board had held a quick vote via email, the letter said, and had approved a daily fine of $50 starting May 21st, to continue until the violation is cured or the maximum amount of $3,000 is reached. They referred again to CCR Section 4.3 and then, almost casually, to a separate enforcement section that allowed them to schedule a hearing at their discretion. There it was in black and white: if I did nothing, the $3,000 would not be a hypothetical. It would be the final number on a ledger that treated our lawn like a misbehaving tenant. The letter ended with a single line that made my skin crawl: failure to comply may result in additional collection activity as permitted by law. I knew what that meant in plain language: somewhere down the line, liens and legal threats were waiting in the wings. My first instinct was to panic. The second was to get precise. I grabbed a highlighter, circled every date, and wrote them out on a separate sheet: May 2nd, first notice. May 9th, second notice. May 21st, fines begin. Then I flipped to the enforcement section in the handbook again and found what I had vaguely remembered: owners had the right to request a hearing before the board to dispute any violation or fine, as long as the request was made in writing within a specific time frame. We still had that window. The enforcement section said, upon timely written request by an owner, the board shall schedule a hearing to consider any alleged violation and related fines. There was nothing in there about the board deciding whether a hearing was worth it. It was not optional, it was mandatory if we asked in time. So I wrote another letter, this one short and very specific, formally requesting a hearing before any fines took effect. I dropped that hearing request at the management office the same day, the dry wind pushing against my back as I walked from the parking lot. The office lobby smelled faintly of printer toner and air freshener. I slid the envelope across the counter and asked the receptionist to stamp a copy with the date received, something I had seen in a random online article about dealing with associations. When I walked back outside, the sun bounced off the hoods of parked cars, bright and sharp, like the light itself was on their side. Days passed, and the silence from the board turned heavy. Technically, my hearing request should have paused everything, but the spreadsheet in my inbox did not know how to respect anxiety. On paper, the fines were set to start ticking. In my head, I could hear them already, an invisible clock counting up, not down. Around this time, the whispers on the street finally turned into something more obvious. A neighbor down the block, one of the few who actually tried to keep things friendly, mentioned in passing that there had been talk at the last informal gathering about our yard. Nothing quoted, just hints. Some people thought the lawn looked too fake, others were worried about what might come next. It was clear that the board narrative was already out there, circling us before we had even had a chance to speak for ourselves. The association thrives on perception. If enough people believe you are the problem, the board does not even need to be fair, they just need to sound official. That was when it really clicked for me that this was not just about money. It was about control, about who gets to decide what normal looks like in a place where everyone pays to live but only a few get to hold the rulebook. The hearing notice came on a Friday afternoon, folded neatly inside another white envelope. This one was labeled Formal Hearing Notification and referenced our lot by number and street name. The body of the notice gave us a date and time, May 28, 6 p.m., at the association meeting room near the community pool. It also referenced, almost smugly, alleged ongoing violation of CCR Section 4.3, non-natural turf appearance. Attached to the notice was something new, a page labeled Board Packet Excerpt, May 28 meeting. It was our first clear peek at how they were planning to present us to themselves. There, under the agenda item list, our lot appeared as Item 4C, Non-conforming artificial turf owner hearing. Below it, in smaller font, was a line that made my jaw clench: recommendation, uphold violation, maintain fines until compliance, consider enhanced collection options if unresolved. This little board agenda excerpt became our second major evidence prop. They had already written the ending before our hearing had even happened. It was all laid out: we would show up, they would nod, pretend to listen, and then rubber stamp what they had already decided. The whole process was not about truth, it was about formality. I spent the weekend preparing as if I were walking into a miniature trial. I printed copies of everything: the original approval, every notice, the spreadsheet showing potential fines, the enforcement clause about hearings, photos of other artificial turf in the neighborhood. I even made a comparison sheet labeling other addresses as Yard A, Yard B, and Yard C, with pictures showing how their turf looked just as vibrant as ours. If they wanted to claim our lawn was uniquely offensive, I would force them to either admit selective enforcement or open a new war with half the street. On the day of the hearing, the evening heat pressed down in a heavy blanket. The association meeting room was a small space with beige walls, folding chairs, and a long plastic table at the front where the board always sat like a panel of judges. A humming air conditioner struggled to keep up with the temperature, sending a faint, uneven breeze across the room. When I walked in with my folder, there were already 4 board members seated, with Mrs. K in the center, a neat stack of papers in front of her. The hearing itself felt like a performance where everyone already knew their lines. They summarized the alleged violation, referencing CCR Section 4.3 and the visual harmony language. They described our turf as excessively saturated, unnatural in tone, and detracting from the neighborhood's desert character. They referenced complaints they had received, though they did not specify from whom, and they emphasized their duty to maintain standards. I responded by walking them through the timeline, the original approval, the lack of specific color rules, and the comparison photos of other lawns. I pointed to the line in the handbook about disputes being resolved according to written standards and previously approved designs, and I reminded them of 3 nearby properties with similar or brighter turf that had never received a notice. I kept my voice calm, but inside, my thoughts were pounding against the walls of my skull. For a moment, I thought I saw hesitation in one board member's eyes, a flicker of doubt as he glanced at a photo labeled Yard B that looked almost identical to our own. But Mrs. K did not waver. She leaned into the language about overall streetscape consistency, framing the issue not as an individual complaint but as a broader policy concern. She suggested that the other yards might be grandfathered or under review, phrases that sounded official but did not appear anywhere in the written standards. When the hearing ended, they told me they would take it under advisement and send a written decision. As I walked out, the sky outside had shifted into a deep orange, and the desert air had cooled just enough to feel bearable. I could feel that the board was not going to back down, their power depended too much on being right. But what they did not realize was that by forcing everything into writing, they were building a paper trail I could use later. Because if the board pushed this all the way to liens and legal threats, it would not just be a quiet little turf dispute anymore, it would become a public example of how far an association could go when no one challenged their authority. And I was already starting to suspect that buried somewhere in their own documents was a landscaping exemption they had granted to themselves that would blow this entire case wide open. 3 days later, the decision arrived. Decision on owner hearing, item 4C. The letter was 3 paragraphs long and did exactly what the board agenda had foreshadowed. They upheld the violation, affirmed the fines, and gave us a new, final, deadline: remove or correct the turf within 10 days, or the daily fines would continue until the $3,000 cap was reached. They also added a new twist: if the fine total reached the maximum and the violation remained, the board reserved the right to refer the matter for further collection efforts, which may include recording a lien against the property. They did not need to say much more. Everyone who has ever lived under a homeowners association knows that word carries real weight. They were no longer just criticizing the color of our lawn, they were threatening our house. This is where the story could have ended in quiet defeat. Plenty of people, faced with that combination of money and risk, would have given in. They would have ripped out the turf, swallowed the cost, and sworn never to push back again. The board counts on that reaction. It keeps things simple, tidy, and comfortably under their control. But a part of me had shifted during that hearing. Sitting under fluorescent lights, listening to them treat my prepared evidence like an inconvenience, I realized something important: they were not smarter than me. They were just more practiced. They had sat in those chairs for years, repeating the same phrases, enforcing the same vague ideas, counting on the fact that most people would not read beyond the first page of the handbook. So while the fines started accumulating on paper, I started doing something else: studying. I read every single page of the governing documents, not just the parts that were highlighted in the welcome packet. I looked up the state laws that governed associations, squinting at dense text on my laptop screen late into the night. The only sound in the room was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of pages as I flipped between sections. That was when I finally found it: the landscaping exemptions. Buried deep in a section of the handbook that almost no one would bother to read, there was a subsection titled Model and Demonstration Landscaping. It described how certain lots within the community, including board-designated model homes and demonstration lots, were permitted to deviate from standard guidelines to showcase drought-tolerant and aesthetic innovations. And right there, in the list of lots receiving that exemption, was a familiar street name: the board president's. There it was in plain text: the association had granted a standing exemption to certain properties, allowing them to use materials and designs that might not otherwise conform to the rules. The justification was that these properties helped demonstrate landscaping options to the rest of the community. The list included a common area near the entrance, the model homes, and one privately owned lot, Mrs. K's house. Her yard did not have turf, but she did have a few unusual elements I had noticed before: brightly tinted rock, oversized imported planters, and a small, manicured patch of ground cover no one else seemed to use. The more I studied those lines, the more obvious the pattern became. Rules, for her, were flexible. Rules, for us, were rigid. The exemption clause did not say it was temporary, and it did not explain why her lot, of all private lots, had been included. It simply existed, like a quiet little shield wrapped around her front yard, while the rest of us were told to obey every line as if it were scripture. At the same time, I discovered something else in the state-level guidelines. The city's own drought plan encouraged artificial turf and water-saving landscapes, and in some cases, even limited how much an association could restrict them. I was careful not to turn this into a legal crusade in my mind. I was not a lawyer, and I did not want to take that path. But I did understand one thing very clearly: if the association was out of step with those guidelines, their position would look a lot weaker if anyone else started paying attention. By this point, our green lawn had triggered multiple notices, a formal hearing, and a daily fine schedule marching steadily toward a $3,000 cap. The board had doubled down on their authority, but buried in their own documents, I had just uncovered proof that they granted themselves landscaping exemptions they refused to extend to anyone else. It was a classic imbalance. One set of standards for the people in charge, another for everyone else. And while their fines were designed to hurt us financially, their exemptions were about to hurt them reputationally. They had written their own trap. All I had to do was figure out how to spring it in a way they could not quietly bury. The moment I decided to stop playing defense and start planning my own counterstrike was not particularly dramatic. It happened on a Tuesday evening, with the sinking sun turning the sky dusty pink and the sound of sprinklers ticking faintly in the distance from the common area. Water the association seemed oddly comfortable wasting on its own patches of half-alive grass. I sat at the dining table surrounded by papers, the board agenda excerpt on one side and the landscaping exemption page on the other. The fines had already hit 4 figures on the latest ledger, and the balance due line glared at me from the bottom of the page. I realized that I had been reacting the entire time, letting the board set the pace and the tone. They sent a notice, I replied. They scheduled a hearing, I prepared. They imposed fines, I studied. It was a rhythm they controlled, and as long as I stayed inside it, I would always be half a step behind. So I asked myself a different question: if they were not assuming I would fight back, how could I catch them off balance? What did they care about more than being right? Property values, public perception, the illusion of fairness in front of the wider community, that was their real currency. The answer started with documentation, but it was not going to end there. I organized our evidence into a clean, chronological packet, but this time, I was not preparing it for the board. I was preparing it for a larger audience, our neighbors, the management company, and anyone else who might see a problem with a board that fined one family for turf while quietly exempting itself from the same standards. I drafted a calm, detailed letter addressed not just to the board but to the entire association membership. In it, I laid out the facts: our original approval, the notices, the hearing, the fine schedule, and the landscaping exemptions that listed the board president's lot as special. I highlighted the contradiction without using inflammatory language, focusing on the simple question of fairness. Why was one private lot allowed to deviate from standards in the name of demonstration, while others were punished for making water-efficient choices? At the same time, I began quietly reaching out to a few neighbors, the ones with turf, the ones who had hinted at their own frustrations, the ones who walked past our yard with sympathetic looks instead of disapproval. I did not rant. I simply shared the basic story and asked if they had received any notices about their yards. Most of them had not, which only confirmed what I already suspected: we were being singled out, not enforced against. What the board did not see coming was that by trying to turn our lawn into an example, they had handed me the perfect case study to use against them, and the moment that letter landed in the wider community's hands, their quiet enforcement would become a public question about why their own exemptions mattered more than everyone else's compliance. I was not planning to storm into meetings or start shouting at anyone. This was not going to be a screaming match in the street or a late-night argument over property lines. My plan was slower, sharper, and more precise: use their own paperwork and their own double standards, in front of the very people whose approval they craved the most. If they wanted to test how much power they really had, we were about to find out. By the time I had finished drafting the letter, the house was quiet except for the soft whir of the ceiling fan. The printed pages lay in a neat stack on the table, next to the final notice the board had sent, now annotated with yellow highlights and margin notes. The next step would be simple on the surface, just sharing information, but beneath it, the real pressure was about to shift. What started as a fight over the color of our lawn was becoming something much larger, a story about what happens when people who think they are untouchable finally realize that other people have been keeping receipts. And as the fines crept toward that $3,000 mark on paper, I was getting ready to make sure the board paid an entirely different price in front of the entire community. I did not wake up the next morning with a burning desire to take down the board. What I did wake up with was something colder and more useful, a plan that actually respected my own time and energy more than theirs. The fines were still ticking on paper, but they were no longer the center of the story in my head. The real focus now was their exemption list, the board agenda, and the gap between what they preached and what they practiced. If the board wanted to run things on paper, I was going to make sure the paper talked back. I started with the letter to the membership. The association had an owner directory and an official email list for community updates, but regular owners did not control it. So I did something simple and perfectly allowed. I printed copies of my letter, slipped them into plain envelopes, and walked the street in the early evening as the desert heat finally began to ease. The smell of hot dust still hung in the air, and the gravel under my shoes crunched with each step as I slid envelopes into mail slots and set them carefully under doormats. The letter was calm, almost dry, and that was deliberate. I did not rant about the board or call anyone names. I laid out the timeline, cited the specific sections of CCR Section 4.3, and included direct references to the model and demonstration landscaping exemption that quietly protected the board president's lot. I added a short section explaining how our city's own drought guidelines encouraged artificial turf and water-smart designs, asking a question instead of making an accusation: was the association really acting in the community's best interest by punishing conservation? I made sure to attach copies of the Compliance Notice 24-051, the fine schedule excerpt that mentioned the $3,000 cap, and the board agenda excerpt that recommended upholding the violation before the hearing even happened. By the time I finished, the packet looked less like a complaint and more like a small case file. In a quiet way, that was the point. I wanted owners to see this as bigger than one person's lawn. I wanted them to feel the discomfort of realizing that if this could happen to us, it could happen to anyone who landed on the wrong side of the board's taste. I also sent a separate, shorter packet to the management company's regional supervisor. This one focused on the contradiction between the board's enforcement and the city's drought conservation materials, including a printout titled Residential Water Conservation Incentives, Turf Alternatives, dated June 3. I was careful with my wording. I did not threaten, I did not demand legal action, and I did not hint at lawsuits. I simply asked how the association's current position squared with the city's push for water-saving landscaping, and whether the management company was comfortable being associated with such aggressive fines over turf color in a desert community. Hook. The question hanging over all of this was simple but sharp. When the rest of the owners and the management company finally saw the board's double standard in writing, would the president cling to her power hard enough to risk her reputation, or would this be the moment her carefully controlled image started to crack in front of everyone she tried to impress? The response did not come overnight, but it came faster than I expected. Within a week, I started noticing small shifts. Neighbors who had received my letter gave us longer, more deliberate waves. One stopped by when we were both at the cluster mailbox, mentioning in a low voice that the exemption list did not sit right and that the fine seemed like overkill for turf. Another neighbor with their own patch of artificial grass admitted they had never gotten a notice and wondered aloud how the board chose who to go after. The real turning point, though, came in the form of a new notice taped to the bulletin board near the community pool. Special open meeting, landscape policy review and owner comments, scheduled for late June. The agenda included an item that could have been ripped straight from my letter: discussion and possible action, artificial turf standards, enforcement consistency, and exemptions. It was clear the management company had nudged the board into addressing the issue publicly, probably out of concern that this could grow into the kind of HOA fines gone wrong story that spiraled far beyond our quiet desert street. Chapter 38:00. The night of the special meeting, the air outside was still warm, but not scorching. The sky had turned a deep violet, and the smell of chlorine drifted from the nearby pool as owners filed into the small meeting room. Normally, board meetings drew a handful of people, 5, maybe 6, most of them half distracted, here out of habit more than concern. This time, the folding chairs filled quickly, and latecomers stood along the back wall, arms crossed, eyes narrowed with curiosity. The board sat at the front behind their plastic table, stacks of papers arranged like props. Mrs. K was in the center, her posture stiff, a printed copy of the agenda in front of her. The management company's regional supervisor was there too, seated off to one side with a small notepad, a quiet reminder that the board was not operating in a vacuum anymore. The humming air conditioner did its best, but the room still felt charged, thick with the collective energy of people who had read my packet and were waiting to see how the board would explain itself. The meeting started with the usual formalities, but no one was really listening until they reached the landscape item. The association's attorney was not present, which meant the board did not have a comfortable script to hide behind. Instead, Mrs. K read a careful summary of the issue, concerns about turf color, the need to maintain desert aesthetics, and the board's commitment to fair and consistent enforcement. Her voice stayed even, but she skipped over one crucial phrase from my packet: exemptions. Then the floor opened for owner comments. Hands went up immediately. One owner asked how many turf violations had been issued and whether all properties with artificial grass had been inspected. Another asked why certain board-designated lots were allowed to deviate from standards while regular owners were fined for similar choices. I listened as the questions built, each one more pointed than the last, and I watched the board's posture shift from confident to defensive. When it was my turn to speak, I did not raise my voice. I simply repeated what I had already written: the timeline of our notices, the fine schedule, the fact that our turf had been approved based on the information provided at the time. I referenced CCR Section 4.3, the clause about resolving disputes based on written standards and previously approved designs, and the list of properties in the model and demonstration landscaping exemption, particularly the one that matched the board president's address. I asked, plain and clear, how owners could have confidence in enforcement when the board president's lot appeared to benefit from an exemption that regular owners did not enjoy. The room went very still. You could hear the faint buzzing of the ceiling lights. Several heads turned toward Mrs. K at once. No one shouted, no one clapped, but the message was unmistakable: everyone had seen the paperwork now, and the quiet privilege written into that exemption list was no longer invisible. The regional supervisor cleared their throat and gently reminded the board that associations are expected to apply their rules uniformly and in good faith. They mentioned, in careful language, that singling out one property while ignoring similar conditions elsewhere could create exposure and undermine confidence in the board's decisions. They also referenced the city's drought guidelines, noting that punishing water-saving landscapes could put the association at odds with broader conservation efforts. The board retreated into a private, executive session for about 20 minutes. The owners milled around in the hallway, the faint sound of splashing from the pool drifting in and mixing with low, tense conversations. People compared notes about their own interactions with the board, their own minor grievances, their own suspicions that rules were sometimes used more as weapons than as guidelines. The theme was the same in every corner: fairness mattered more than perfection, and what bothered people most was the sense that some owners were untouchable while others were not. When the board finally returned, their expressions were tight, but something had changed. They announced, in formal language, that after further review, they had decided to rescind our violation notice and forgive all fines associated with the turf issue. They framed it as a clarification of policy rather than an admission of error, saying that the written standards for artificial turf color would be revisited to ensure greater objectivity and clarity. They also stated that all existing landscape exemptions, including those granted to specific lots, would be reviewed and brought into alignment with uniform community standards. In simple terms, that meant three things. Our lawn was no longer a violation. The $3,000 fine ledger vanished, reduced to a zero balance line on the next statement with the cold but beautiful phrase, administrative adjustment. And the board president's own special exemption, her shield, was now under the same microscope she had tried to turn on us. That could have been the end of it right there, but the real sting, the part that turned this from a simple correction into a quiet, satisfying revenge story for everyone watching, was still coming. The board president was about to find out that the same owners she had casually targeted with her rules would now be the ones deciding whether she kept the title that made her feel untouchable in the first place. The special meeting ended, but the fallout did not. The association's annual election was already scheduled for later that summer. For years, turnout had been low, and incumbents had stayed in power because no one else really cared enough to organize. Now, for the first time, people had a reason to pay attention. In the weeks that followed, I watched as small changes appeared. A flyer circulated quietly encouraging owners to vote, emphasizing the importance of balanced leadership and respectful enforcement. 3 new candidates stepped forward, all regular owners who had read my packet and decided it was time for fresh voices on the board. None of them promised to burn everything down. They promised something both simpler and more radical in a place like this: consistency. When the election results were announced, the news traveled quickly down the street. Mrs. K did not lose her seat entirely, but she lost the presidency. She was outvoted for the top spot by one of the new candidates, a calm, detail-oriented owner who had quietly introduced themselves to me after the special meeting and thanked me for taking the time to do the homework. The board president, who had once stood at the center of the table, now sat 2 chairs to the side, holding fewer papers, speaking less often, and no longer able to push through her personal tastes as community standards. The funny thing is, our lawn never changed. The same rectangle of carefully chosen synthetic turf still sits in front of our house, framed by gravel and river rock, the blades catching the desert sun in a way that almost makes them glow. Neighbors walk past it now without staring, or if they do stare, it is with a quiet sense of recognition, not suspicion. For them, the yard is no longer a symbol of defiance, it is a reminder that the rulebook works both ways if someone bothers to read it. Financially, the difference was huge. $3,000 is a number you feel in your bones when you live in a place where every month's budget is a careful balancing act. Knowing that the fines had been zeroed out was not just a relief, it was like getting back a future that had been slowly shrinking with each letter. We used some of the money we did not have to pay to plant a few more native shrubs and install a small shade sail in the side yard, a quiet celebration of the fact that conservation and comfort did not have to bow to someone else's narrow idea of aesthetics. The association itself changed too, in small but noticeable ways. The new board instituted clearer written standards for artificial turf, including specific guidelines about color, pile height, and maintenance. They conducted a full inspection of all existing turf yards, not to punish people, but to make sure the rules were actually applied evenly for once. They reevaluated all prior landscape exemptions, including the president's, and reclassified them under a new policy that required board-wide approval and periodic review instead of private, open-ended exceptions. I kept my folder of documents, just in case, but I stopped living in a state of quiet dread every time I walked to the mailbox. The metal cluster at the end of the street went back to delivering normal things: coupons, flyers, the occasional boring bill. When a letter from the association did arrive, it was usually a generic newsletter instead of a threat disguised as compliance. The desert evenings felt lighter, the heat still heavy but not matched by a knot in my stomach. Most importantly, I learned something about boundaries and power. In a place like this, authority often hides behind politeness and paperwork. It presents itself as concern for property values and community harmony, when sometimes it is just one person's preferences elevated to the level of law. But that authority is not unlimited. It can be questioned, documented, and reshaped by the same people it tries to control. Our story is not the most dramatic thing that has ever happened in an association. There were no screaming matches on the sidewalk, no court showdowns, no viral clips of people melting down in public. What we had instead was something quieter but, in its own way, sharper, a reminder that the real power of an association does not sit in the hands of the few people at the table in the front of the room. It sits in the hands of everyone who lives there, pays dues, and has the patience to read the fine print. And if you ever find yourself standing in your own driveway, holding up final notice that insists your yard is wrong because it does not match someone else's taste, remember this: every rule they use against you is written down somewhere, and sometimes, buried in those same pages, is the path to push back and win. Tell me your harshest HOA lawn or drought fine horror.